I don't know about you guys, but I really love old-fashioned pennant races. I especially like minor league ones, and especially ones you've never heard of. You'll recall that I talked about the famous Baltimore Orioles of the early 1920s not too long ago. Lefty Grove and the Orioles are interesting, but they won the International League by dozens of games each year. I'm much more interested in the exciting local pennant races, the ones that most of us have never heard of. As baseball fans, we tend to underestimate the history of the minor leagues. Now, I don't think that this is our fault. Actually, I think that we've been conditioned to do so. Let me give you an example. I grew up in Utah in the 1990s. I remember the hype surrounding the return of AAA baseball to Salt Lake City. I went to a lot of games at the ballpark near downtown Salt Lake City, especially in 2002. When I look at the 2002 Salt Lake Stingers roster today, I see a lot of major league talent. Tone Figgins, Francisco Rodriguez, John Lackey. But the crazy thing is that back then I didn't know any of these players by name, and I was following all the games and attending as often as I could afford to. We're not used to minor league teams that can catch the attention of an entire city. We're also not used to local heroes who receive a lot of press and a lot of attention. And we're certainly not used to meaningful minor league pennant races. I mean, after all, it really doesn't mean much when the best players are pulled up to play in the major leagues during the stretch in September, right? Today we're going to talk about the Minneapolis-St. Paul rivalry. The Minnesota Twins name is supposed to convey fond memories of that old rivalry. In fact, you can see it in some of the old team logos. But most people have completely forgotten about the rivalry, and that's a shame. It was a wild one. Well, you can trace the rivalry back to the original Western League. That would be the league that later became the American League. Charles Comiskey bought the Sioux City team back in November 1894. There was a lot of confusion at the time since Comiskey was still managing the team in Cincinnati. Comiskey moved the team up to St. Paul, where they played not far from the old Minneapolis team. This continued until late 1899 when Comiskey and Ban Johnson decided to move the St. Paul team to Chicago. You can see in the old box scores that the team was moved and not disbanded and restarted. Many of the St. Paul players listed in this September 1899 box score were still with the White Stockings in 1901. That led to a lot of confusion as the American League decided to challenge the National League monopoly head-on. There was a baseball vacuum of sorts in the Midwest, leading to rumors of another Western League forming. Nothing actually happened in 1901, however, which meant that there was room for a new American association to start up in 1902. The history of minor league baseball in that 1900 to 1903 period is crazy. It's gonna take a long time to unravel everything. The old national agreement, which formally separated the major and minor leagues, was broken by Ban Johnson in 1901. The fact that the American League didn't fold immediately strongly challenged Major League supremacy. The reality is that Ban Johnson's attack on the National League was probably the most revolutionary act in all of 20th century baseball history. There's an important thing to remember when we're talking about the minor leagues in those days. There were no farm teams. That was a Branch Rickey development decades later. Instead, minor league teams existed independent of major league teams, although there were sometimes secret agreements behind the scenes. That's the reason why pennant races were possible, actually. There were no September call-ups. You stayed with your team until you were sold. There were end-of-season minor league drafts, but teams still had to come to an agreement with each other. And yes, that meant that some great players never played in the major leagues. Now, it's crazy to me that we even need to explain this system. The concept of the current minor league system, which is an imperial system, a colonial system, is one of colonies that are stretched around North America. It's become so natural to us that we have a real hard time of conceiving of completely independent minor leagues. But if you sit down and think about it, you'll realize that our current system is anything but natural and ordinary. I'm biased, I know, but I tend to think of the current system as an excuse for major league clubs to not pay market prices for star players. Lefty Grove was sold for $100,600 to the Philadelphia Athletics, for example. That price is higher than what the Yankees paid for Babe Ruth. That was huge money for Jack Dunn and the independent Baltimore Orioles in the mid-1920s. You can see why teams these days prefer the colonial approach. Okay, now back to the Twin Cities. The greatest of the American Association pennant races took place in 1915. The Minneapolis Millers started off slow. They were in dead last by June 3rd. Part of the reason is because one of their stars was up with the Washington Senators. This was Henry Rondeau, a catcher turned outfielder who had hit over 300 for Minneapolis in 1914. Rondeau started 1915 in Washington, D.C., but was then sent back to Minneapolis after hitting only 175 in 14 games. Okay, this is where all that talk of independence becomes kind of confusing. I'm not certain, but I certainly suspect that Rondeau was actually loaned or optioned to Minneapolis from Washington. He was 28 years old, and he certainly wasn't a development project in 1915. However, he did wind up going back to Washington in 1916 and then back to Minnesota again for the next few years. I've got a feeling that his rights were likely owned by the Senators the whole time. Now, the papers will tell you that he was drafted by the Senators to go back there in 1916, but that's a pretty strange coincidence when you consider that there are 16 Major League teams. The whole thing is really confusing. Rondeau was married with children. It's likely that his family had settled down in Minneapolis by 1915, and homesickness might have caused him to play poorly in Washington. And Rondeau wasn't the only man on the Millers with Major League experience. Pitcher Mutt Williams had appeared in 6 games for the Senators in 1913 and 1914. At age 22, he wound up winning 29 for Minneapolis in 1915. Left-handed pitcher Earl Yingling had pitched for a handful of teams from 1911 to 1914 with varying degrees of success. He won 19 for the Millers in 1915 and then 24 in 1916. World War I veteran Bill Hopper pitched in 19 games in the major leagues, never winning a single one. He won 18 for the Millers in 1915. Now, I know all about minor league equivalencies and all of that stuff, but the truth is that none of these men really had enough major league experience to make a meaningful statistical comparison. And you can say the same thing about their crosstown rivals. Lefty Liefeld, remember him, the former Pirates pitcher? He was only 31 in 1915. He went 17-14 for the Saints with a 2.41 ERA. Charlie Hall, a key starter on the 1912 Boston Red Sox, won 24 games for the Saints in 1915. And 21-year-old rookie Bob Steele contributed 20 victories of his own. Walton Cruz, who had played for the St. Louis Cardinals the year before, was the leading hitter on the Saints. He wound up having a 10-year major league career after this season. And I could go on. These teams were minor league teams, sure, but they weren't like the minor league teams that we're used to these days. Like I mentioned, the Millers started off in last place. They improved to 7th by July 10th. But by August 14th, they were back in the thick of things. Now, August 14th and 15th were key days for the 1915 Minneapolis Millers. They had one of those streetcar series against St. Paul that weekend, with one game in St. Paul and then one game in Minneapolis over a Saturday and a Sunday. And this is where it all turned around for them. The first game started at 3 p.m. on the afternoon of the 14th at Old Lexington Park in St. Paul. Minneapolis, once in last place, were now in second place, 7 games behind the Saints. Now, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, this was the first and the only time that Minneapolis and St. Paul were neck and neck like this in the pennant race. Minneapolis had recorded 6 wins and 12 defeats against their rivals so far that season. But things just felt different this time. There was a tremendous crowd present that day, well over 14,000 fans, so many that they spilled out onto the playing field. The Millers came out with a bang, scoring 3 in the first and 3 in the second. Earl Yingling, whose major league career looks pretty bad, went the distance, holding the first place Saints to 4 runs. And then it was back to Old Nicollet Park in Minneapolis for the Sunday game. Okay, now on top of all the weirdness of minor league baseball at this time, there were also blue laws in Minnesota. Apparently, no inning could start after 6 p.m. on a Sunday, if I understand it right. Although the game was advertised as starting at 3 p.m., the managers decided to start 20 minutes early, just in case. And this time it was Hopper, the old war hero, pitching for the Millers. In front of another overflow crowd, 13,000 fans at least, the Millers came from behind to win. The Saints started off with a run in the top of the first and followed it up with another in the 5th inning. But that was all the war hero allowed. Minneapolis tied the score with 2 in the bottom of the 5th, and then a bevy of base hits knocked old lefty Liefeld around in the 7th. The Millers scored 2 more runs. They never relinquished that 4-2 lead and cruised to a victory. Though neither game was particularly dramatic, it really was the turning point of the season. Just 1 week later, the Millers were in first place. But as was the case with all the old pennant races, they won some and they lost some. Down the stretch, it was that old Washington Senators cast-off, Mutt Williams, who wound up being the hero for the Millers. Between September 13th and September 18th, Williams pitched in 5 games, winning 4 and losing an 11-inning heartbreaker due to poor fielding behind him. And that included the clincher against the Cleveland Spiders on September 18th. Oh yeah, there were 2 teams in Cleveland in 1915. Yeah, that's going to require some explaining. Charles Summers owned both the Cleveland Indians and the Toledo Mud Hens. I'm not sure if he used Toledo as a formal farm team or not. That's going to take some more research. Anyway, the Federal League threatened to put a team in Cleveland. Summers did the only natural thing. He put his minor league team in Cleveland to share League Park and ensure that there was a home game in Cleveland every single day. 1915 was a bizarre time in Major League Baseball, that's for sure. In the end, the Millers completed their worst to first campaign in a pretty good imitation of the famous 1914 Miracle Braves. From what I can tell, this seems to have been the closest of the old American Association races. But it's kind of hard to do this research, as you've probably guessed. I mean, I can't go to Retrosheet to look up box scores. In fact, I can't even find schedules on there or on Baseball Reference. And that means I have to mess around with old newspapers, which can take hours or days or weeks. We really could use a more organized approach to researching minor league baseball. But until then, I'll keep attacking it one step at a time. And keep in mind as well that the old minor leagues really were a lot more interesting than they are today. I mean, even though we have access today to advanced statistics, to analytics, to equivalencies, and we can kind of figure things out, the truth is that we're really missing out on a lot of the drama and the stories and the fun that was an integral part of minor league baseball back in the old days.